The story began on a gray, rainy Monday morning, and the office felt colder than usual, as if the weather had seeped inside. Emily Carter walked in quietly, her coat damp from the drizzle, her eyes tired but alert, and there was a hesitation in her steps, like she wasn't sure she wanted to be there. She sat across from me, clutching her bag tightly, and her hands were trembling just enough to show how much fear and anxiety she carried. I asked her what brought her here, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I think my husband is hiding something from me," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. She wasn't angry, she wasn't yelling, she was sad in a way that made the room heavy, and I could feel the tension before she even explained the situation. Emily had been married to Daniel for 12 years, and on the outside, their life looked perfect. A suburban home in New Jersey, 2 kids, a dog, Sunday dinners, and a calm, organized routine that neighbors admired. But inside, Emily had started noticing small things that didn't add up. Daniel was coming home later, texting constantly, and often seemed distracted. He had excuses for everything, long business trips that weren't scheduled, and a phone that never left his hand. Emily said she didn't want revenge, she just wanted to know the truth, because the uncertainty was slowly eroding her from the inside. She didn't want to hate him, but the fear of being lied to felt unbearable. As she spoke, I noticed the way she paused whenever she said his name, like Daniel had become a ghost in their home. Her emotions were tangled between love, fear, and sadness, and it was clear that asking for help was both brave and painful. She signed the paperwork, agreed to move forward, and left the office with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. The door closed behind her, and I sat for a moment, feeling the weight of her story linger in the empty room. I didn't know yet that this case would become more complicated than anything I had dealt with before. Just as the rain outside started to let up, the phone rang, and I wasn't expecting another client so soon. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, and careful, asking for an appointment. When she arrived in the afternoon, I felt my stomach drop, because everything about her energy and the way she spoke made me pause. Her name was Sarah Miller, and she wanted the same thing. She asked for proof about Daniel, the same Daniel Emily had just spoken about. It was impossible, shocking, and surreal. 2 women, 2 lives, 1 man, and both trusted him completely, unaware of the other. Sarah was different from Emily in appearance, in her manner, in her energy. She lived in Toronto, worked in marketing, and had been dating Daniel for 3 years. She believed he was divorced, that he had moved on from a past life, and that he loved her fully. Her voice was full of hope when she spoke about him, and that hope made the betrayal even more tragic. She had never suspected that he could be living a double life, and the trust she had placed in him was complete. Her eyes softened when she mentioned him, and I could see a spark of happiness that had not been there for Emily. Yet, both women were asking for the exact same proof, seeking the same answers, and neither knew that the other existed. I started connecting details in my mind, noting the patterns in Daniel's actions, and slowly, the reality became clear. Emily suspected a stranger, an unknown betrayal, while Sarah believed she was the only one. Daniel had created 2 separate lives, 2 different stories, and 2 different worlds for the women who loved him. Neither of them had the slightest idea that their paths would eventually cross. Even just investigating the case felt heavy, almost unbearable, because the truth would hurt both women. I realized that every call, every meeting, and every observation would carry the potential to change lives forever. As I planned the next steps, I felt a mix of emotions: shock, disbelief, and empathy. The thought of confronting 2 women with the same truth was daunting, and I knew that it would not be easy to guide them through the pain without breaking their trust. At the same time, I felt the responsibility to uncover the facts completely. Emily and Sarah had both come to me with vulnerability, and I had to honor that by being professional, careful, and honest. I couldn't predict how they would react when the truth was revealed, or if they would even believe what I uncovered. But I knew one thing for certain: Daniel had woven a web so carefully that both women had been caught without even realizing it. The day ended with me reviewing what little evidence I had, tracing Daniel's patterns, and preparing for the work ahead. Emily's hope for clarity, Sarah's trust in a love she believed was real, and Daniel's betrayal all hung in the balance. I couldn't ignore the feeling that this case would change lives. And as I closed my notebook for the night, I knew that when the truth finally came out, it would shock both women, and maybe even change the way they saw love, trust, and themselves. Part 1 closed with that quiet tension, the calm before the storm. Two women, unknowingly connected by the same man, waiting for answers they didn't know would shatter their worlds. And somewhere, Daniel continued his life, unaware that the unraveling of his lies had already begun. Part 2 began the moment Sarah Miller stepped into the office, and the weight of her story hit me immediately. Unlike Emily, who had come with cautious fear, Sarah carried hope, a belief that Daniel was devoted to her. She spoke about him with a soft smile, recalling his kindness, the way he texted her good morning, and how he promised to take her on a trip to Toronto soon. It was easy to see why she trusted him, why she believed in a love that now, looking back, had only existed in half-truths. She had never suspected a lie, never imagined that Daniel had another life across the border. Her heart was open, her emotions pure, and that made the betrayal that would follow even more devastating. As she explained the details of their relationship, the pieces started to fit together. Daniel's long trips that Emily had noticed were the same ones Sarah described as romantic escapes. The texts Emily had worried about were the same ones Sarah treasured, filled with sweet messages that promised devotion. I realized that the man I was investigating had been living a carefully constructed double life. Every action, every word, every promise had been tailored to fit each woman's perception. It was a web of lies so intricate that even someone watching closely could be overwhelmed by the details. Watching Daniel's patterns unfold was painful, almost like witnessing heartbreak in slow motion. He called Emily every night, saying he was stuck in traffic or attending late meetings, keeping her believing in his presence. Then hours later, he would be in Toronto with Sarah, holding her hand, laughing, and promising a future he never intended to give. Every photograph, every small gesture, every phone call added evidence to the truth. And as the evidence built, the tragedy of both women trusting him so fully became impossible to ignore. Sarah, like Emily, wanted proof, but the emotions behind it were different. Emily's request had come from fear, a desire to uncover hidden truths. Sarah's came from hope, a need to confirm love and commitment. Both women were on opposite ends of the emotional spectrum, yet both were equally vulnerable. Neither imagined that the other existed, and neither would have guessed that Daniel's lies were so consistent, so deliberate. It was a story of deception that was as heartbreaking as it was shocking. I began to follow Daniel, noting his habits, his messages, and his movements. It was like watching two separate lives overlap, moments where one woman's trust was being stolen to feed another's happiness. Each discovery brought a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, disbelief, and even sympathy. Sympathy for the women, who had invested so much of their hearts in someone who had lied with such precision. And frustration at Daniel, who seemed blind to the damage he was causing, more concerned with maintaining his double life than considering the pain he would inevitably create. Emily and Sarah were each unaware that the other was about to enter their story. The thought of revealing the truth to both of them was daunting. It would hurt, it would shock, and it might feel like the end of love itself. But it was necessary, because lies could not last forever, and the truth was slowly becoming undeniable. The more I uncovered, the more the reality of Daniel's actions became clear. He was living two separate lives, crossing cities and borders, giving each woman what she wanted without ever considering the consequences. One afternoon, I gathered the evidence I had so far: photos, texts, call records, and travel details. It painted a clear picture of a man who had carefully built a life with two women, keeping each one in a bubble of trust. Emily's home life, with the tension of distance and unexplained absences, and Sarah's romantic experiences, full of attention and affection, were two sides of the same coin. The contrast was heartbreaking, and the thought of giving this truth to either woman felt almost impossible. I wondered how they would react, who would cry first, who would be angry first, and if they would even believe what I had uncovered. In the quiet moments of preparation, I thought about Daniel, unaware that the web he had woven was unraveling. He had promised love, attention, and commitment to two people, and yet had planned for neither. Every small lie, every carefully chosen word, and every misdirected action had brought him closer to exposure. And with each piece of evidence, the truth became less about proving a point and more about giving Emily and Sarah the clarity they deserved. There was a strange tension in the air, a feeling that something monumental was about to happen. Both women had entrusted their hearts to Daniel, and soon, the truth would shatter the worlds they had built around him. But before that, there was a quiet space of anticipation, a calm before the storm. Emily, with her quiet sadness and cautious fear, and Sarah, with her hope and trust, were unknowingly connected. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and it would change everything. I closed the files for the day, knowing that the next steps would be the hardest part of the journey. Two women, one man, one truth, and a web of emotions that could not be untangled without heartbreak. I thought about what would happen when Emily and Sarah finally discovered the other. Would they feel anger toward each other, or would the shared betrayal create a strange understanding? The questions lingered, but the answers would come soon enough. Part 2 ended with that tense, quiet suspense. The story had shifted from suspicion to revelation. The pieces of Daniel's deception were aligning, ready to expose him fully. And I knew that the day when the truth would be revealed would be one they would never forget. Part 3 began the moment the truth was finally ready to be revealed, and the tension in the office felt almost unbearable. Emily had come first, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly as she sat down. When I laid out the evidence, photos, call records, travel details, and messages, her eyes widened with disbelief. Each photo showed Daniel with Sarah, holding her hand, smiling at her, promising a future Emily had believed was only hers. The truth crashed into her quietly but completely, like a wave breaking over a fragile shore. She didn't scream, she didn't yell, but the tears fell freely, hot and unstoppable. It was heartbreak in its purest form, the kind that leaves the room heavy and silent. Emily kept asking questions, her voice trembling as she tried to understand how Daniel could do this. She had loved him with her whole heart, trusted him completely, and yet he had lived a double life. The shock was overwhelming, the betrayal unimaginable, and the house of trust she had built for 12 years collapsed in an instant. Even as she cried, there was a strange calm in her expression, a sense that knowing the truth, as painful as it was better than living with uncertainty. She asked about every detail, wanted to know when he had been with Sarah, how long the lies had lasted, and if there had ever been a moment of honesty. Every answer was another weight pressing on her heart, but she listened, needing the truth even if it hurt. Then Sarah arrived, her energy different, more vibrant but also nervous. She had believed Daniel loved her completely, that he had left the past behind. When she saw the evidence, proof that he had a wife who had loved him for years, proof that he had lied to her, the shock hit her like a lightning strike. Her face drained of color, and she gripped the chair, steadying herself against the reality she could not deny. There was anger, but also sorrow, confusion mixed with disbelief, and a deep ache in her chest that seemed to fill the entire room. She had trusted him blindly, given her heart fully, and now everything she believed in was shattered. Emily and Sarah were both in the office, and yet they had not seen each other yet. When they finally looked up and noticed the other, the room became still, tense with unspoken questions. For a moment, neither spoke, both unsure what to say or how to feel. The first reaction could have been anger, jealousy, rivalry, but something unexpected happened instead. They exchanged a glance that carried shock, sadness, and, surprisingly, understanding. Both had been deceived, both had been hurt, and in that moment, they realized that their pain was not competition, but shared. The conversation that followed was slow and careful, each woman speaking honestly about her experience, her trust, her heartbreak. Emily spoke first, explaining the distance, the suspicion, the long nights of wondering if she was imagining things. Sarah shared her perspective, the hope, the romantic gestures, the belief in a future she had dreamed about. There was a quiet intensity in the room, a rawness to their emotions, but also a strange comfort in knowing they were not alone in being deceived. Instead of turning against each other, they listened, and slowly, a bond formed out of shared pain, a connection forged in heartbreak. Daniel, of course, was absent, but his presence lingered in the room like a shadow. The women talked about him, about his lies, about the future he had stolen from them. There was anger, yes, but also a sense of clarity, an understanding that the responsibility for rebuilding their lives was now entirely their own. Emily decided she would leave the past behind, focusing on herself and her children. She realized that forgiveness for herself, not for Daniel, was necessary. Sarah, too, chose to step back, to heal, and to learn from the betrayal rather than let it define her. It was not a happy ending in the traditional sense, but it was real, and it was honest. Both women had lost a man they loved, but they had gained something more valuable: clarity, self-respect, and the knowledge that they could survive heartbreak. Emily returned to her home with a quiet strength she had not known she possessed. Sarah went back to Toronto, her heart aching but her mind clear, ready to focus on herself and her life. Neither would forget Daniel, but neither would let him control the narrative of their future. The aftermath was unexpected in its quietness. They did not need revenge, they did not need to confront him further, because the truth itself was enough. The shared experience had changed them, taught them about trust, betrayal, and the strength that comes from surviving heartbreak. It was a bittersweet ending, filled with sorrow, but also with the first steps toward healing. The bond they formed, even if only temporary, was a reminder that honesty, even painful, could create connection and understanding where lies had only sown chaos. I thought about that day long after the meetings ended. 2 women, 1 man, 1 truth, and lives that would never be the same. It was a case that stayed with me, not because of the lies or the betrayal, but because of how the women responded. Their courage, their honesty with themselves, and their ability to see each other as allies rather than rivals left a mark. Sometimes, love does not end with happiness, but it can end with clarity. Sometimes heartbreak can lead to self-discovery, strength, and even unexpected friendship. And in that quiet reflection, I realized that the story was never really about Daniel. It was about Emily and Sarah, and the choices they made after the truth was revealed. It was about reclaiming their lives, understanding their own worth, and walking away from a love that had been false. The story ended not with Daniel's presence, but with their strength, their resilience, and the beginning of lives rebuilt with honesty and courage.